what I can do is I can just start off by giving you a bit of the background to how the film came together, and then if you have some questions, do raise your hand. And if you do need to go, there are posters and things outside, some goodies. So, oh, hello. Oh, thank you. I'm going to put it down just for a second. See if I can get them to my wife. A long way away. Right, so the film started with the producer James Gay Rees. Actually, before I even get into all of that, I just want to say how special it is for me to be here representing the crew, the people who made the film, to be here in San Francisco, to see a packed house, to see all of you here enjoying the film. Yeah, it's a really amazing feeling. We kept being told nobody cares about Formula One, no one cares about Senna here, you're never going to get a film released. And we never believed that. And you guys are the proof, the proof has always been in the pudding. The audience have basically brought the film out in the US, and so we are really thankful to all of you guys. So from all of us, thank you. I'll go back now. 2000, well, even before that actually. James Gay Rees' dad used to work for JPS. He knew Senna when he was driving for the Lotus in the mid-80s. And he used to come home from work just saying, I've just seen this guy, he's just different. He's the most intense, most charismatic, otherworldly driver or human being that I've ever come across. And James wasn't at that time particularly into Formula One. And so he heard that, but he kind of let it go. It wasn't until 2004, 10 years after his accident, that he read an article in the Times of London. And it was a reprint of Senna's obituary. And the journalist was not a Formula One journalist, but he kind of writes features. He's met many famous people all over the world, and he basically said there was the person that he remembers the most is Senna. He met him once, interviewed him once, and there was just something about the guy who, he had this aura, he had an otherworldly presence, he had something about him. And it was a language that James's dad used to use. And so that's when he clicked and thought, maybe there's a movie here. And James is a drama producer, he's made feature films before. But he thought maybe there's a film here to be made about Senna, but as a documentary. His opinion was if you make a film about Muhammad Ali, you get Muhammad Ali to play Muhammad Ali. If you make a film about Senna, Senna plays Senna. No one plays Senna better than Senna. So that was his instinct. He approached a company called Working Title Films, one of the biggest production companies in Europe. And they're kind of known for more films like Forwardings in a Funeral and Notting Hill and stuff like that, United 93. Never made a documentary before. But Eric Fellner, who's the chairman, is a big car guy, big fan of motor racing, and he's tried to do dramas about Formula One before, but they never managed to get them together. So he liked the idea of doing a documentary. There were lots of moments of huge amounts of luck. There's something, the Senna effect that kept happening during the process of making this film. And one of them happened very early on. One of the development executives at Working Title Films, James spoke to her and she said, you've got to meet my husband. He's the world's biggest Senna fan. And that's Manish Pandey. He's the writer and the exec producer of the film. Manish is a surgeon. This is his first movie, but he is a huge Formula One and Senna fan. So James and Manish then got together, put together an outline, a 10-page document, and approached the Senna family in Sao Paulo. Flew over there. Manish pitched to the family, a 40-minute pitch. Everyone was in tears by the end of that meeting, and even though Manish had never met Senna before, Viviane Senna stood up, hugged him, and just said, "You really knew my brother, and we give you permission to make the film." So then they had to approach Bernie Eccleston. So to get the access to the footage, they had to approach Bernie. So the meeting was very short. Bernie walked in, didn't sit down. They pitched to him, and he said, "Okay, look, just give me all the money you've got, and I'll see what I can do." And I shook hands, and then they went away. And then it took 2 years, I think, to try and get all the contracts and agreements done with all the lawyers between Bernie, family, Working Title, Universal, everyone. 2 years of talking. At that point, they approached directors, and they spoke to quite a few directors, very well-known documentary directors. But for me, luckily, they're all busy, or they didn't get it, or they don't like Formula One, or who knows what. Whatever reason, no one else did it. And eventually, they approached me. I've never made a documentary before, but I've made dramas. But I'm a big sport fan. I kind of was into sport long before I was into movies. And I remember this era, I was watching Formula One because it was on TV, it was on the BBC, it was on every other Sunday. So it was always on in the background. And so I remember the rivalry, the kind of accidents in Japan, were live on the radio in those days. They weren't really live on TV. So I remember listening to them on the radio when I was at college. I was watching Imola live. So I knew enough about the driver, and I knew how huge he was. I didn't really know too much about the man. And that was a big learning curve for me during the process of making the film. So I came on board, and there was an 8-month period when we were told we were going to make the film, but we actually didn't get the money through. So I had 8 months. I had an edit suite, but I couldn't hire an editor. So for 8 months, I was just looking at material on YouTube. And this was kind of some weird thing of going to work, but just sitting there watching YouTube for 8 months. And not really going to work because I wasn't getting paid. But it was the point when the film really came together, because Manish has got lots of tapes at home. Manish and I actually cut a short film to try and see how could this work on his laptop. We put a 10-minute short together. And that's the kind of light bulb moment. That's when I thought, well, actually, we don't need interviews. We don't need this to be like most documentaries with contemporary interviews. There's so much material. This sport exists through TV. Senna's so famous in Brazil, in Japan, everywhere, all over the world. Everywhere he goes, there's a camera. When he goes to work, there's a camera. Then we started seeing the drivers' meetings. There's a camera there. And, they're not performing for the camera because these cameras are owned by Bernie. They're Formula One FOM cameramen. So they're trusted. So therefore, there's nobody worrying there's a journalist in the corner there. And that's, there's something special there about that particular guy in that particular sport at that moment in time, before public relations kicked in, before Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and any of that. They said what they thought, and they didn't have to worry about it because, the cameramen are all part of the circus. So the idea was, let's just make the film entirely out of archive. That was my instinct. The first cut was 7 hours. The second cut was 5 hours long. We projected that one at the cinema in London, which I thought was quite cool. You had to bring lunch and everything. But we then cut it down to a tight 3 hours, and then 2, and then eventually, the thing is important, worth mentioning, the agreement with Bernie was for 40 minutes only of footage. The rest of the film was going to be interviews. So it's going to be a much more traditional talking heads kind of documentary. So we had an agreement for 40 minutes. I kept cutting this film entirely out of archive because I just thought this is a way to do it, and because Senna, he carries the movie, he's our lead character. I don't want interviews from people guessing what Senna was thinking when we can get Senna telling you what he was thinking. Bit by bit, everybody on the team agreed it's the only way to make the film. So it led to one thing: we had to go back to Bernie. We had to renegotiate a contract, which, as you would know, he's very good at. He's quite happy to do that. Well, weirdly enough, he was this time. Something to do with Senna. I mean, by now we've got to know a lot of people within the Formula One circus. We've met Ron, we've met Professor Watkins, Frank Williams, Alain, everybody. We'd spoken to everybody. We've done our research. People realised that because we'd spent so much time doing our research, that we were not, trying to do a job from the outside on the sport. We were actually fans, but we wanted to show what was actually happening at the time in the sport. And this is kind of considered by a lot of people one of the golden ages of Formula One. And Bernie said, okay, and he gave us a deal. He doubled the deal. Instead of 40 minutes, we're allowed to have 80, which is why we have the film that we've got now. So that kind of film was always going to come out in Brazil, in Japan, in the UK, and in Europe. But as I said at the start, we were always told, forget the US, no one cares. And one way it was good, there was no pressure. We just wanted to make the film. But we felt there is an audience there. We felt there were a lot of Europeans, there were a lot of Latinos, there were a lot of racing guys, there were a lot of fans. But maybe, people just don't know they're out there. And so we pushed to bring the film to Sundance in January. And we took it there with absolutely no PR, no publicity, no money behind us, no distribution, nothing at that time. And we just put the film there. And because we had no public relations, I think we had no way of publicizing the film apart from Twitter and Facebook. And we just put the word out there. And there were 6 screenings, and within weeks, they all sold out. It was one of the first films to sell out totally. Did amazingly well. I'd say about a third of the audience were fans of Formula One that flew in from all over the States, drove from miles. The rest of the people had just heard about the film, knew nothing, didn't know the twists and turns, didn't know the roller coaster of Senna's life, didn't know the ending. And that was another key moment for us, was that maybe the plus point in the US is there are a lot of people who don't know Senna, therefore they don't know how amazing his story is. So the whole thing is a learning curve for them. Anyway, he won the World Cinema Audience Prize at Sundance. And that was really the beginning of the journey of the film coming out here. It showed at South by Southwest in Austin. It got a standing ovation there. It won the audience prize at the LA Film Festival, which brings us to last weekend, where it opened in New York and LA and had the biggest opening for a documentary this year, and did great numbers, which means that then the people in the industry start noticing the film, which is a good thing. And here we are now. It's opening in San Francisco and another 10 or 12 cities across the US this weekend. So, this is a big deal. Next weekend, another 12 cities. So we're going to be hitting about 40 or 50 cities in the US by the end of the month, which is really great. So, as I said, thank you to you guys. You made it really happen. So that's where we are. Now, that's the summer. Any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Amazing movie. Thanks for making it. Any chance you'll have the 3-hour cut available as a DVD version?
Or the 5-hour?
We have a version that's going to be on a DVD, which is an hour longer. But it features, all of the interviews that we did. It features those interviews. We've got an hour of Ron, Prost, the journalists that we interview. All of them are featured in the film. So there is a version which is the DVD and a Blu-ray version, which is that. If the film does well enough, then the thing is we have to go back to Bernie once, maybe. I don't know if we're going to do it twice, but you never know. You never know. Maybe we'll be able to do some special screenings, some one-off screenings, hopefully. Yeah.
Does the longer version include some of his personal life, since that was as tumultuous as his driving career?
Well, does the longer version include more of his personal life is the question. The thing about, my job was to try and make it into a movie. Now, if I could show things, I put them in the film. If I can't show it, I just made a call to say we're not going to do the kind of gossipy version. Because there's plenty of those in Brazil. There's plenty of TV Globo specials with this girl, that person, every week. They're out there, so we just decided not to do that. If there's footage, if there's a way of showing this is what's going on, fine. So in a way, there was a longer version which had more from Adriani and people like that, and other girlfriends that he had in the middle. But we didn't really get into that too much, just because they've all got their own TV shows. They're all very famous in Brazil.
Did the family and the sister talk about Adriani and any of that with you?
We spoke to the mum. We spoke to his mum. We spoke to Viviani. We spoke to Bianca, his niece, to Bruno. Bruno's the boy in the boat, driving the boat, and on the jet ski at the end. Well, to be honest, they don't really want to talk about that stuff. You're asking a question you already know. Okay. Yeah. Good question. So the people we had to show the film to, we felt were the family, were Ron, Bernie, Professor Sid Watkins, and Alain. Before the film came out, we tried to show it to all of these people. So last year during Monaco, when Bruno was racing, the family were all flying over from Sao Paulo. And so we hired a cinema in Cannes and showed it to the family, which was the most emotional screening, really, because even when he's winning, even when people normally laugh, they were all crying. So that was really heavy. But at the end, Viviani did stand up and kind of hugged everyone and said, you've got the right balance between the genius on the track and the humanity of the man off the track. Ron, that was pretty emotional. He came along through it a couple of times in London, cried a lot at the ending. At the beginning, he's got this reputation of being a tough guy, but he's actually been a soft guy. And Senna is, someone he really loved him. So that was another very emotional screening. Sid, that's really tough because Sid was there. Sid's the first guy that has to go to him. He doesn't really watch it now. He's coming to the end of a lot of screenings, but it's too heavy. The two people we had trouble pinning down were Bernie and Prost. Bernie, in the end, came to at the London premiere. Came along. That was the first time he saw it. And really loved it and said he didn't think he could make a film out of the footage. Now he's probably quite happy because there's a lot of films in that footage that he's got in his archive. Alain, we tried to set up lots of screenings. We offered to bring a print over to Paris, wherever he wanted, or Switzerland, or wherever. He was always too busy. And in the end, we know he's got a DVD, and what he said is he hasn't seen it yet. Yeah.
So there was a stark contrast in the footage you chose of the close-ups of Senna sitting in his vehicle in the early races versus the footage that you chose for the final race. How difficult was it to find that footage because the contrast is amazing?
In terms of technically, or in terms of the shots?
The shots, because there's no concentration at all in that last. I mean, he looks. The shots that you chose, he looks so thoroughly distracted. He doesn't look like a racer even getting ready for it.
He should not be driving. No. No, I mean, this is just the tragedy of that day, that weekend. He looked so troubled. I mean, I've seen a lot of footage of Senna. I've seen thousands of hours. There's only one other race ever where he's not wearing his helmet, sitting in the car. I mean, he never, ever sits without his helmet on. And so he's always focused. He knows exactly what he's going to be doing. He's visualizing the race. There's one race in Monaco that I've seen of him a couple of years before where he's not wearing a helmet. The rest of the time, he comes onto the track with the helmet, doesn't take it off. So that in itself was different, and it's almost like he wanted everyone to see it. I mean, there were about 20 camera people around him by that stage. He's obviously not in the right place. He's not in the right mood to drive. There's a lot troubling him in terms of everything. The weekend, the car, personal, who knows. There's just everything's going on, and it's very sad. And Sid tried. Professor Sid Watkins did talk to him and said to not drive. But the thing about Senna is he doesn't quit. He drives. That's what he does. His answer to problems is to go even faster, generally, So that's, you can see the footage that says it all. Right at the back.
During your research, did you uncover any speculation of, why the car crashed?
Yeah, I mean, the main theories are the ones in the film. Some people still think the car bottomed out because of the tire pressures, but we've shown the film to a lot of Formula One drivers, and Martin Brundle, who took over Senna's driving the McLaren and who commentates for the BBC now, has looked at the sort of film quite early on, seen it a few times, and says when he looks at that in-car footage, the final lap, he hadn't seen that before. For him, that car is handling absolutely perfectly. For him, it's not bottoming out, but it's doing exactly what it should do. So for him, it takes away that theory, and he's a driver. And so for him, something happened to the car, and I think it's a mechanical failure, is what happened, which is what caused it to go straight. And then so therefore the other theory, the main theory, is something happened to the steering. But what's important to clarify is that's what caused the car to go straight. He didn't make a mistake. Some people said at the time he made a mistake. He didn't make a mistake. I think we can discount that. They don't even think of that as a corner. That's taken as a straight. It's taken flat. But what happened was it's a series of events. It's like 10 different things had to happen in exactly the right way to cause that accident, to cause him to go straight, to cause the front right tyre to come off, for it to spin, and for the suspension arm to pierce his helmet. No other bones broken, no bruising, nothing else. He should have walked away from the accident. It was just the one, So if you believe in God, it's an act of God. If you don't, it's very, very bad luck, But everything had to happen exactly in a certain way for it to be caused, for that to have happened. Yeah.
So you said you've watched thousands of hours of footage of Senna's life. Is there anything that came out to you or that you noticed that you think is unique that someone like the press or us as fans of Formula One wouldn't know?
I mean, I think, well, in a way, that's why we made the film. We made the film to try and sum up what we saw of him. I mean, there's a lot more material that would be richer if we could make the film longer. There's stuff like 1989, the drivers' meeting. This is like a few hours before they're about to race for the World Championship. The one where Balestre says, people are looking at you, they think mistakenly that you are an example, that one. The longer version of that scene, there's a French driver a few weeks before that had a terrible accident. Jacques Lafritte or something like that. There's a young French guy who had a terrible accident, career-threatening. So Balestre says, I'm looking to raise money for him because his career maybe, So I want you to all give $1,000, and the teams give $1,000, and whatever, I'll give $1,000 and we'll give him some money. And everyone goes, okay. And Senna, being Senna, is the only one that says, hold on, what's he going to do with that? What's that? That's nothing. That's nothing. I'll give 10 grand. We'll all give 10 grand. All of the drivers give 10 grand. And whatever we give, you double from all the fines you've taken off us this season. And everyone agrees. And then he goes, no, it's not my money. It's not my money. I cannot do this. I cannot do this. And they start arguing, right? This is like hours before he's about to race for the World Championship. Alain doesn't say anything, no one else says anything, but Senna argues with Balestre for a long, long time. And I find it amazing because he's not like sitting there absolutely worried about this is how I'm going to drive the race. He's sitting there worried about a young French driver whose career may be over. They then drive, we know what happens. For me, Prost turns into him. Senna goes on, wins the race, gets disqualified, When he then gets a suspended sentence, 6 months his license taken away, and he gets fined 100 grand. Balestre, the next sentence, Balestre says, now I'm going to give half of this money to this young French driver that I've decided to create fine. So instead of taking $1 grand off of Senna, he takes 50 grand off of him and pays for the fine. So that was the long version of that scene, which we just don't have time for. But that was summed up Senna. Even at the most kind of point when he should be concentrating, how many sports people who are really, really good at what they do, can you imagine who would do that at that moment in time, start worrying about someone else? But that kind of stuff, I kept seeing footage like that. And that was what made him so interesting, because of the reputation of being a tough guy on the track, causing more accidents. What Jack Stewart, you should know what Stewart says. And yet on the other side, you have the other guy that a lot of the drivers knew, which was the one that was worrying about everyone. And I think the more and more I saw of that, the more and more I thought it made him special, actually, and very different. Yeah.
So Another one.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So many of the drivers today say that Senna is the greatest driver. Many people in general believe Senna was the greatest driver of all time. There's a noticeable lack of these points being mentioned in the movie. Was that a conscious decision, or were people just not asking that question at that time? Or is it a case of basically the way he died raising his stature a little bit?
No, we had lots of footage of that at the time. We just chose not to get into that. That's not really the kind of film we were trying to make about whether or not everyone says he was the greatest of all time or not. Because, if you would, it depends. People say he is the greatest, then you have other people that say, well, yeah, but you can't compare different eras, there were great drivers at different times. And then if you bring out stats, then you can say, well, yeah, but Schumacher broke almost every single one, and so he must be in. So we just thought, we're not even going to go there. We're just going to show you what he was like during his life and what he was amazing at. Now, if you ask any drivers, they're all going to say Senna, right? Especially the new ones, the young drivers, because he was their hero. He's the guy that they saw. He's the one that they know about. But, it's impossible to compare Clark and all these other drivers, So we just chose not to get into that. It's not really the point of this film. There's too many kind of TV versions of this that have already been done where they interview everyone, and we just chose not to do it that way.
Yeah. He seemed like he got involved with like the regulations and whatnot. And when they first showed, the stabilizing parts of the car, the computers were doing the work, it seemed like he didn't like that. Was he at all instrumental in what wound up getting them banned?
He wasn't happy when the Williams technology started to take over. Yeah, I mean, there's more interviews that we've seen. There's a longer version because he just thinks it's bad. For him, if you're a good driver, then you should be the good driver. And if it suddenly means that technology evens it up so much to the point where, anyone that drives a Formula One car is obviously brilliant, okay? But, there are some that are more brilliant than others, maybe. And he just felt that he evened it up too much. You could put anyone in the car and they'll win. And basically people started switching off. That was the main reason the rules changed, not because of him. He was one of a few that were saying this isn't particularly good for the sport. But the main thing is that the authorities at the time, it's Max Mosley who made a decision. Because, Mansell won in 92 halfway through the season. The title was over, and in 93, Senna won 5 races that year, so he kept it alive longer than people thought because he was so brilliant. That was like people say it was his best year. But people were switching off, so that's why they decided to change the rules. But that's a constant thing in Formula One, as you would know. They change the rules every year, mid-season. How many sports change the rules mid-season? But if it's getting too much one way, okay, we'll change that. That's now banned. And oh no, it's not anymore. Is it? Oh, so that's just the nature of the sport. It always has been. He wasn't happy about it, obviously. Yeah.
So the director of dramas, obviously, you're used to kind of working with actors and bending them to your will and tricking them into doing what you want them to do. How is it for you directing without actors with
It's amazing. Yeah. Well, when you've got a guy like Senna, though, then when you've got a lead character like Ayrton, then it's not a bad thing, actually, I have to say. There are times when it's great to be on set and to have all of these issues to deal with. There are other times when it's great just to be dealing with post-production and just to be editing. And so, yeah, it was an interesting thing because it was very different an experience. It was like being, for me, it was just the luckiest job ever to have these dailies in a way to deal with, this much footage, and to have a character like that. I just didn't know how much existed. I didn't realize how much of that was out there until we started making the film. And it was a really interesting, very difficult, similar principles, all the same rules that you have in drama at play here. Because a film, essentially, even though it's a documentary, we thought of it almost as a drama. His life story, his kind of 3-act structure of the beginning, the young guy coming into the sport, working his way up, winning the first world championship, the middle being the ups and downs of the rivalry, and then we slow time down when he gets to the Williams and Imola, like this final act. It just seemed to play like a fiction film. So it was essentially a lot of the rules that you'd have in a drama. Yeah.
Were you able to find the last seconds of the final lap? I don't think we've been able to, but having seen a lot of footage, was that consistent? Because there is a lot of talk that the last seconds were deliberately missing. Was it consistent with all the other footage that you saw?
I mean, a lot of people say they've seen more. I haven't. What you see is what we saw in the actual archive. When we asked for that shot, we thought we'd be told it doesn't exist. But what you see is that final lap, and just the very last frame. Then after that, it goes to black. So now what we've been told is that the TV director had so many cameras, could only record certain ones at a certain time. At that point, because the shot was breaking up so much, flicked to the shot behind, which is from Schumacher's car, which is how most people saw it on TV live, was from behind and Senna's car veers off. So that's what we were told, that there is no more footage. You know, as you know, and as we all know, people say they've seen more. I honestly haven't. So I don't know if that exists or not. And if it did, then, you know why it's not there. Who knows? I haven't seen it. That's the last frame we saw in the actual archive. Right in the middle.
This is more current related. How do you feel as a person in media for as how the switch to Sky Sports pay how that now? You said you used to listen to it on BBC for free, and now it's paid.
All roads lead to Rupert. No, it's a long conversation. That's a bigger conversation. But you know, if you know anything about a hacking scandal, if you know anything about what's been going on with kind of relations with, you know, Murdoch and the government and stuff like that, it's all linked. Okay, if you have people who are working for the Prime Minister, and the BBC is always a place that you're trying to cut funding from because, you know, people look at it as being a tax. It's a tax I'm very happy to pay because I love the BBC and I love what they do. You know, you don't have commercials basically. You have amazing radio, you have amazing TV, you have sport. But if that funding is then cut, then they've got to make that money up somewhere. They make the money up by cutting things. And one of the things they cut is sport because it's expensive. And who buys up the sport? You know, so it's interesting kind of political thing. But that's maybe another conversation we can have. Yeah, at that. Yeah.
Hey, it's the little lone blue flagger. I made it. You know who I am. We've been talking. But my question is, did Frank Williams see this film? Right. And also, the chief steward, the former chief steward, see this film? Roland.
Right. Yeah, I know he has. Because there's a guy in Belgium who contacted him and spoke to him, and he gave an interesting interview. It's actually the guy who did the interview from Belgium for a magazine translated it. I asked him to put it on our Facebook page. If you get a chance, you should have a read of it, because he had some kind of interesting things to say about the Lest and that particular period. I mean, he's very professional in saying, you know, I don't know about what's going on, but it was kind of an interesting thing. So I think he has seen it. Within the Formula One community, I think everyone has seen it. So Frank, we didn't put on a screen particularly. There was kind of, Williams was a funny one. You know, there's no upside really for the team. He didn't ever finish a race for the team. You know, pretty painful stuff. But we did interview him, and he gave us his time, and we spoke to him. And but in the end, it's kind of a touchy thing, and we didn't want to get into the whole thing of having to get approval from lots of people. You know, we were making a film. We were just going to show what happened. You know, we're not. There are other films that people have tried to do where they kind of investigate and they go into court cases and all that. That just wasn't that's not what we were trying to do. So I think, as far as I know, the press people from Williams, I think, have seen it. I think there was so many screenings happening in London, so I wasn't always there, but people from different teams were coming along to see it. Yeah.
You mentioned a couple times the creative process that you went through developing the story for this thing. I was just hoping you could maybe kind of, I'm assuming there were twists in the road along the way. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Any kind of more specifics? What kind of millions?
What the process was like.
Okay. Well, it's interesting because so Manish is the guy with the knowledge of the sport. So he had written an outline, a storyline, which was a much bigger story in a way of that decade. It had PK, it had Mansell, it had lots of other things in there. And as we started working, the main thing for us is we had to figure out how to make a film that worked for the fans, that got the facts right, but also worked for people who've never heard of Senna, who've never watched a race in their life and have no interest in racing. So that balance was what we had to achieve. And so part of it was we had to strip down the story. So that's why PK's not in it so much, because he was kind of the era before, and a lot of Senna and PK's arguments happened in the press. It wasn't necessarily always happening on camera. Mansell was the other person that we took out. I mean, there were lots of incidents, you know, we could have shown a lot of crashes between them, things in the Lotus time and throughout, actually. But actually, we had to focus on the main rivalry, which was Prost. And the way we did it was, so we were looking at footage because there was so much of it around. But Manish would be the one who would say, okay, look, there are so many races, but these are the 7 or 8 key races that we should start with. And then we try and access the archives. around the world, in Sao Paulo, in Rio, in Japan, in London, in Paris, in Rome, all over the world. We had people, researchers, and they'd be sending us footage from those races, and then we'd cut it together and combine it. And then something new would always pop up that we didn't know about, and then Burlesque would turn up because we'd find some drivers' meetings. So we go, okay, let's find out more about him, and then other things like his faith were important, and Brazil was important. So we had a series of storylines that we were looking for, and the aim was to try and find a way to visualize them, find a way to show them. And whenever there was a hole, we'd discuss what was missing with James, myself, and Manish, and then the editors. And then we'd have to give a note to the researchers around the world for them to find a particular character or a particular story beat that took place at a particular time somewhere in their archive. And then they'd send back a bunch of footage, and it would be something totally different, but it'd take the film off in another direction. So we'd rewrite the script and re-edit. And so that process was going on, because obviously we didn't start with all the footage. You know, we didn't know most of this existed, and we only had 5 days, originally 5 days access to Bernie's archive. So we left that right to the end, because we didn't want to use it up, okay? So we were looking at a lot of stuff, because if you know where to look, a lot of it's on YouTube. And not just in English language, you know, you spend enough time on YouTube, you end up in Brazilian YouTube and Portuguese, and if you go that way, you end up in Japanese YouTube, and there's a whole bunch of stuff there. Because all of the key races ended up in Japan. There's a lot of material. You know, if you want, you can find tapes in Japan of the for example, the 89 Japanese Grand Prix, the entire race from Senna's point of view. 70 laps or whatever it is, 60 laps, just going, you know. People buy those tapes, and then you can get the same thing from Prost's point of view. And like, literally, you don't see another car for 15 minutes, and a lot of this one. Yeah. So anyway, this is like available if you know where to look. So we had all of this footage, and the story was just constantly changing. And then pretty much the big problem we had from day one was the film was too long. So we had to pare it back and take out, and reduce the story and try and make it stronger. So you couldn't repeat story beats too many times. So that was really the process. We had 2 brilliant editors, Chris King and Gregor Saul, who documentary guys, because none of us were documentary people. The producers, the financiers, the producer, director, writer, none of us had done docs, but the editors were documentary people. And then the other person worth mentioning is the composer, Antonio Pinto, who's Brazilian. He did City of God, Central Station, did some music film Collateral, Behind the Sun. He's a great composer, lives in Sao Paulo, from Rio originally. He contacted us when he heard we were doing the film. He's a big Senna fan, so he said, I really want to do it. And I don't think we can afford you. He said, no, I really want to do it. So I said, okay, we'll write some music. And I'm in London, you're in Sao Paulo, I can't fly you over and I can't fly over there yet. But if you write some music, I can work with it and edit with it. And then that will be a good way for you to get on the movie. And so that's what he did. He wrote music before he saw any of the film, just from his memories of Senna. And one of the main themes that he wrote is the one where Senna wins in Brazil for the first time. That theme, which also plays at the ending when you see Senna go-karting. It's one of my favourite pieces of music in the film. So that was written before he saw any of the picture, but purely from his memories. And there are 2 other cues in the film which come up a lot of the time, which were written before the film. So he was the other person that was working while we were still figuring out the picture. He was writing music. So that it was a very organic process, not like a typical drama where you write a script, raise the money, shoot it, and cut it. All of this was happening at the same time over a 3-year period. Yeah.
Having watched a lot of footage of what's arguably a golden period in Formula One, what do you think of Formula One today?
Right, today what I think Formula One, I think actually it's quite a good time right now. I think there's a lot of guys that can race, and I think there's a lot of champions out there, and I think there's 3 teams that can win races, which is good. So I'm enjoying it. I think there have been some spectacular races. I always think, how does Bernie work it out so that, I don't know what's going to happen for the second half of this season, how they're going to keep it going to the last corner. Because the last few years, it seems they've gone to the last race. So I think it's good. I think, for example, the German Grand Prix that happened a few weeks back, I thought it was really exciting and also very well directed. I look at the way the cameramen choose the shots, thinking, why, that's not a good angle, I've had this conversation with Bernie and his lawyers saying, they're driving 200 miles an hour, why does it look so slow on TV? Why am I never aware of what country they're in? They just all look the same. There should be something that gives you a sense of place. Because when you see Monaco in our film, there's not a huge fence. Literally, there's guys leaning on the railings, aren't there? And you can see that you're actually in a town. And I think some of it's not very well shot. And certain races I think have been really exciting and well done. So I'm enjoying it right now. I think it's good. The what, sir? No, they're younger, aren't they? The drivers are younger. That's the main thing. The Senna's era, Senna was 26 when he got into Formula One. They were grown men. They'd lived a bit of life, and now they're kids, low 20s. So, you know, and Ron said this to us. A lot of these guys, they're karting from the age of 4 or whatever. That's all they do. So in that side of their life is very developed. The personal side of their life is not developed because they're not really doing what boys have to do, like going and chatting up a girl and being turned down. Whereas now, you know, they're all millionaires by the time they're 18 and 19. So it's kind of slightly different. So they're very young. And obviously we can't go back to the time when people, because if people complain that they don't say what they, drivers are all the same. But when someone like Lewis does say something, everyone jumps on him. So, that's the problem. It's a different age. There were men who said what they thought, and they didn't have to worry about it too much because they were able to deal with it. I don't know. That's my theory. What do I know? Yeah.
You talked about, in the beginning, you talked about Senna moments, how I guess things just worked out. I'd like to hear a few more of those.
I mean, it just seemed to happen throughout. It's the only film that I've been involved in where, part of the reason we're here now, people from all over the world have got in touch with us saying, how can we help? People from Mexico, people from Russia, people from Greece, people from Italy, he's just so loved. And there's something about him, but there's also something about the sport. So unlike other sports where people, are more partisan, and if you like one team, you can't really like another team. Formula One's slightly different. There's a kind of community of people that are into the sport generally. So even if you're a Ferrari guy, if you like some other driver, you'd still be interested in the way that works. So it's just been all over, the fact that a lot of the countries where the film's got a release has been because the audience have pushed for it. Because they've said, we want to see the film at the cinema, and the distributors have said, no, this will go straight to DVD. And actually the pressure has come from the audience saying, no, we want to see this, we'll put on a screening ourselves. And when it starts selling out, the distributors have sort of said, oh, okay, maybe there's something here that we should, follow up. So that process has just been happening throughout. Do you have a question?
Yeah. Are you being asked for any input for like the new Ron Howard movie that's coming out, like Niki Lauda and explaining the rivalry around the 70s?
Just talking about the Niki Lauda and the James Hunt movie, the Rush, I think it's called that. Ron Howard is doing now. Paul Greengrass was going to do it. I've had contact with Paul Greengrass. He contacted us after he saw our film and really loved it, and then for whatever reason decided not to do that film. I've seen Ron Howard. I was at Silverstone this year, and he was there with a writer, but we haven't been contacted. Even though it's the same company, they're doing their own thing. So, yeah. Okay, we'll take a couple more questions. I guess everyone's got work tomorrow. I haven't done that. I'll be here all night.
Presumably, you've seen the Top Gear. So one of the things that Jeremy Clarkson brings up is how it's sort of a conundrum how sometimes Senna is so giving and how he jumps out of his car to go help a person, but at the same time, he often puts himself into a position where he and his other drivers are going to crash, right? What do you think about that?
I mean, that's the conundrum. That's what makes Senna so special. He was the guy that was a tough guy on the track, and but he was the one that cared the most off the track. And so, again, Martin Brundle's told stories where before they got into Formula One, they had this great rivalry. And he would be the one that would, drive them to a place where the other driver had nowhere to go, and they're going to crash, and then they crash. So Brundle would say he'd cause the incident, but then he'd be the first one to run up to him, "You okay?" I'm worried. And if you're okay, forget you now, move on. But that was him. That's what makes him interesting. He is complex. He was the guy. He would intimidate people. He would make a way of. In a way, if you had an incident with him, pretty much everyone knew he was the fastest. He could go around a track quicker than anyone else. He could put the car on a limit and over the limit and keep control of it. When other people put it on a limit, they'd lose control. So he was, basically that yellow helmet, they'd see it in the rearview mirrors, and then they'd think, well, if I stay on my line, we may have might as well get out of the way. They're not consciously doing it, but it became a thing where he intimidated people. Because if you don't, we're going to have an accident, and he's faster anyway, okay, fine. And then just give him a gap that he went through, and that he used that. That seems to be the way he was able to do that. He intimidated people. And that was his thing, of being that intensity and that drive and that pushing, not just in the car, but after the car, the debriefing would go on for hours, and Alain was used to, setting pole and then going to play golf. He couldn't do it anymore because he beat all of his teammates. It didn't even look like he was trying, and he'd get pole position. Senna comes along, first year in the McLaren, and suddenly he's being beaten by the guy. So Senna's staying there till 11 o'clock at night, debriefing. He's got to stay there now at 11 o'clock. And then even that started to be a battle, because he would be competitive with everything. And so Prost felt like he had to do that. So that whole thing becomes a part of his way of being. He's just full on the whole time. And other people can't keep up. So I think that's just the nature of it. But then there was this other side that maybe wasn't necessarily that well known. A lot of British journalists, a lot of French journalists were quite tough on Senna at the time because of his reputation. And they didn't necessarily know. What's interesting is a lot of the interviews that we've got were not necessarily with British journalists. There are a lot of other journalists that were talking to Senna. And when Senna, for example, talks about his faith, he stopped doing it in English because he got attacked if he talked about God. They said, you must be nuts if you talk about God and drive a racing car. So most of our interviews in our film, he's speaking in Portuguese. Because he'd give a press conference in English and it'd be quite bland. I had a few issues with the tire pressure and, this, that. And then okay, that's not 40 minutes press conference, nothing really usable. There'd be another interview straight afterwards in Portuguese for another 40 minutes. We'd assume it's the same, but it's not. It would be totally different. So his press conferences were often done for the people he was speaking to. So the one for Brazil was very different to the one he was doing for the English language journalists. And that was, I thought, quite interesting. There were different people inside of him that he was speaking to. But that's why I like him. I like him because he is complicated. It would be boring to make a film about somebody who is just really nice. It's a movie, it's very short. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but in the second incident where Senna hit Prost and won the championship, a year or so later, I thought I read that Senna admitted that he did it on purpose because of everything that happened to him before. So I want to know if you got any footage.
Yeah. It's 1991 when he wins his triple championship. He wins his third championship in 1991, and at the end of that, he gives a press conference where he's really angry. It's just another scene. It was a great scene. It used to be in the film, but it just became one of those that got lost, where he said, he starts pointing at the camera, he's really, really pissed off, and he says, because of what happened in the past. The reason we haven't got that in is because officially what happened was he never spoke about 1990 until he won the championship in 1991. So everybody was waiting for him to talk about it. In our film, we found this tape where before the race, he said, this time it's going to be my way. I don't care what happens. I got fucked before by the system. This time it's going to be my way. So we found an audio tape. And this is just another example of how the film came together. We've got Super 8, 16mm, 35mm, 1-inch U-matic, which is this old format that I used to shoot my first shorts on. And when he's been interviewed, there's always people holding cassettes in front of him. We start looking, so whose hand is that? Oh, it's that German journalist. Okay, let's call her up. And we'd contact them and say, have you got your audio cassettes? Have you got your TDK A90 cassette tapes somewhere? And a lot of these journalists have still got these bags of tapes from the late 80s, mid-80s and 90s. So we found that piece of audio on a cassette tape where he says, this time I'm going to do it my way. I don't care what happens. And he said that, beforehand because he felt like he got screwed the year before. So we decided to almost mention it beforehand rather than wait till 1991, which is actually when he gave that interview.
There was a key moment when Prost on French TV spoke to Senna at the Imola race just before the start.
The other way, Senna sent a message to Prost for TFR. When they do the lap, where they say, I'm now in 5th gear and I'm doing the 180 and now I'm going to 6th and now we've got to turn 3rd gear. So he did a lap like that during practice. I think it was on Friday. He did it Friday or Saturday. And Prost wasn't actually there and he recorded something. And at the beginning of it, he said, Alain, we miss you. And then that was played to Alain on the Sunday. So we had that, again, it was in an earlier cut. The reason we didn't use it was more to do with the technical aspects of putting the film together. By the time we get to 1991, when he wins his 3rd World Championship, and then between 91 and 94, we essentially decided to hold back on how much driving you see for 92 and 93. So when you do first see him in the Williams, it's going to be that final lap, if that makes any sense. So then that lap becomes more powerful because you actually haven't been in the car with him for a while. It's become all about the politics. It's become all about you've got to be in that car and technology and, I've got a veto on him and da-da-da-da-da. And it becomes about the kind of sport, being more about business rather than a sport. So in a way, one of the reasons I thought I don't want to use that beat is because you have to show him driving. There's no other footage to do that unless he's in the car saying, now I'm going to drive you around Imola. And by the way, Alain, we miss you. And Alain wasn't actually there yet. So it became a bit messy on how to use it. So I decided not to. In France, that's like a big deal that we didn't use it because it's like, you know, how can you not use that? This is such an important moment. But, you know, I made that call not to put it in. For us, him on the podium in Australia '93 was the moment when they're together, you know, when there's a visual thing there rather than just an oral thing. Yeah.
So do you speak Portuguese now?
I can pretty much understand it when I read it, yeah. I can understand Portuguese in the film because I've heard the line so many times, yeah. It almost seems like, it sounds like the word with an O on it, you know. Yeah.
Any part of the process where you're pulling your hair out? Or...
Yeah, I've gone grey, man, all the time. It was a long job, you know, it's a long process. It was very hard because the whole thing about doing documentaries, you don't actually know what exists. You know, and the good side of it was the fact that we were doing it with working title and Universal meant that we had time. Because on other films we would have run out of money and run out of time. So you would have had to deliver the film much earlier. And because we didn't know what existed, it took us years to uncover a lot of the material you see in a finished film. At some point on an independent movie, we would have had to just do the interviews and cut the interviews in. You know, the talking heads, because that way you save screen time and therefore you save money. With working title, we almost edited for a year longer than we had hoped to, because they were able to just say, just keep going. It's good, but it's not quite there yet. So that's kind of how the film came together, really.
One more quick question. You mentioned earlier that you saw a lot of Bernie's footage towards the end of the whole process here. That changed a lot of the way.
Well, what happened was we'd see a lot of it, and we'd go to. When eventually we had to renegotiate, and we got 10 days out of them, and in the end we got a few more. But we'd go up to the guys at the archive and say, look, we're looking for this shot from this particular race on this date, and they'd say, how do you know that shot exists? How do you know about that? We go, well, we saw it on YouTube. They go, when? The next time you look at YouTube, it's gone. So I think they liked us because we became their security somehow, not meaning to, but you know, we were like, we want this shot because we've seen it here, and they'd be like, right, delete. Anything on back then in the middle?
So everyone's claiming that they had a special bond with Senna. If the documentary could be longer, what relationship would you explore more?
Well, Berger was one. His best mate was really Gerhard Berger. I suppose to go into kind of the more personal stuff, there were other relationships. You know, there's a girl that was in the middle who was with him around 91 time, which was a serious relationship. There were quite a few different things like that. I mean, there were other little details. I don't know if any of you have seen the footage of Senna just when he's about to sign for Lotus. I'll tell you one would be Sid Watkins. Okay, he and Senna became friends very early on, but we couldn't find any footage of them together. The very, very first time Senna finishes a race in a Tolman, he ends up in hospital. And there's footage of him being interviewed. TV Globo in Brazil, being TV Globo, breaks into the hospital. Senna's lying in the hospital bed with a neck brace on. And they're still doing an interview. Did you know where you finished? He said, no. Are you in pain? Yeah, it really hurts. Do you know you got a point? You've got a point. Yeah, they actually do an interview. It's quite funny, but it's also very tough to look at because the first time he drives a Formula 1 car, he ends up in hospital. And the last time he drives a car, he ends up in hospital. So that was something that I thought was at one point we had a whole sequence which is what Senna did before he got into Formula 1. You know, he won everything apart from the World Karting Championship because Fullerton always beat him. So that's part of the kind of payoff at the end in there. But what I was getting to is just before he gets the drive with the Lotus, he gets Bell's palsy. He gets like a stroke. So I don't know if you've seen this footage. It is on YouTube. Well, it's not Bernie, so you might still see it. But it's really shocking to see because he cannot blink. He can't close his face is actually paralyzed, and he's very close to losing his drive with Lotus. So before his career had started, it nearly ended. And Professor Sid Watkins, gives him the right drugs to heal him, to give him the chance to become the driver he was at Lotus. And so that friendship began very early on because he was very skinny also at the beginning, so he needed to toughen himself up. And so there's a character in Brazil called Nuno Cobra, who was his trainer, who was a big part of Senna becoming Senna. He's the guy that taught Senna about, using his brain to win races and to concentrate and to visualize races and to do a lot of the stuff that sports people do all the time now. But he was like the first to start thinking that way. So there were people like that we just couldn't get into. Nuno's the guy at the ending when Senna's jogging takes his top off and who takes his pulse. So Nuno Cobra is a huge part of Senna's life, and again, just didn't have time to fit these in. And Gerhard Berger was, the Bond years, the fun times that they had at McLaren together when they partied a lot. But again, it was very hard to show that it becomes a series of anecdotes. There's many others, I'm sure. Yeah.
Was the Bell's palsy what the parents were doing with the eyes?
Yeah, that's why they're looking in his eye, because he's not able to blink, so he's got something in his eye and his mum's removing it. That's that. Yeah, because that's just as he's getting into the Lotus time. Yeah. Okay, I think we should wrap this up. You guys have got jobs to do. Thanks a lot. Thank you.